Welcome to Ferment Radio. I am your host Aga Pokrywka and my guest today is Lauren Fournier. Lauren is writer, curator, video artist and filmmaker based in Toronto. Her work brings together artistic practice, exhibition making, critical and creative writing, fermentation, food, socially responsive programming and collaborations. She is the director of Fermenting Feminism, an ongoing site-responsive, multi-locational curatorial experiment that uses fermentation as a metaphor and material to engage historical and present-day feminisms. Fermenting feminism will be the main topic of today's conversation, particularly Lauren's article, Fermenting Feminism as Methodology and Metaphor, Approaching Transnational Feminist Practices Through Microbial Transformation. Hello, Lauren. I am so happy to have this conversation with you. Can you say a couple words about yourself?
My name is Lauren Fournier. I'm currently based in the prairies of Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 lands that's in kind of the center of Canada. I'm an artist, a curator, writer, fermenter. I met Agnieszka here through the Fermenting Feminism project, which I started back in 2017, I believe, or maybe 2016. Yeah, that project is one that's really brought me in touch with so many incredible fermenters and artists and curators and writers and activists and chefs and brewers and all sorts of folks who are engaged in fermentation. And it continues to really open my eyes and my heart to the possibilities of fermentation.
Could you say a couple of words about fermenting feminism itself? Like, how did it start?
I did recently write this article for Environmental Humanities. I tell the whole story there, but I'm super happy to kind of go through it. So basically, I trace it back as early as 2012, where I was really interested in both feminism and fermentation, but also didn't necessarily feel connected to a community that was engaged with these questions and ideas. And coming from more of a kind of zine culture, DIY culture, I had the idea of putting out an open call for submissions under this term, fermenting feminism. I do feel like humor plays a role in my work, and I just thought it was kind of funny, like fermenting feminism. I was interested, in also as like a literary nerd. I had just finished my master's in English literature, and I ended up doing my PhD in literature. And I feel like from a kind of an etymological perspective and a word perspective, there was, the text and the subtext of what is being said just with two simple words placed beside each other. So, what does it mean to ferment feminism in a kind of speculative sense? What does it mean to bring these two disparate modes, or two modes that maybe are indeed related but haven't really been put into that kind of proximity together and see what results? It's very much a site-responsive curatorial experiment is how I tend to describe it, where you take this general premise or framework of fermenting feminism. It can be understood and interpreted in different ways, but placed in a given geographical, cultural, historical context. We can then work with local artists, thinkers, fermenters, brewers, witches, scientists, all sorts of folks to then come together and experiment around the possibilities of fermentation in that local environment.
You've mentioned before this article, Fermenting Feminism as Methodology and Metaphor, you've written, and I've read it, and I have to say that I found it very inspiring how you've shown different angles of what happens when we put together these two words, fermenting and feminism, through representing 10 different angles to that.
So yeah, that was articulating the framework a little bit more from that academic perspective, but I really like that it read as a manifesto too, because that is what I see it as. Everything from fermentation as accessibility, or fermentation as biodiversity and a kind of interspecies symbiosis.
When I was reading your article, I was imagining that we can use this framework you've built in your text and treat it as a lineup or schedule for our conversation. I was imagining that for each point of your framework, we could think together about practical examples of what those points could mean in practice.
I'm intrigued. No, I'm certainly open to it.
So we have 10 points to go through together, and the first point is fermentation is political. Does it matter that it's on the first place?
I think my thinking around opening with fermentation as political is establishing this idea of politics from the start, because I do think that it's something that weaves through all of the subsequent points in different ways. In this article, I do open with my friend's libertarian boyfriend at the bar, and I still vividly remember watching. It was actually, we were watching the U.S. election for when Mitt Romney was running against Obama for Obama's second term, and we were, in Canada, Canadians, but still really caring about the outcome of the election, of course. And we're all at a bar, and I remember my friend's boyfriend, who, libertarian already, I'm kind of rolling my eyes a little bit. Political leanings aside, he was just like, fermentation's the only political act left. And it was interesting when he said that, because it was very open-ended and unclear what exactly he meant by that. But it kind of stuck with me, and I knew that he was someone who does a lot of at-home fermentation and brewing and bottling. And what I took him to mean is that fermentation, in that sense, is the only act that's outside of the purview of capital P politics, that it's not regulated, it's not over-regulated, and of course, as libertarian, not wanting any kind of regulation. Maybe one example that comes to mind is the artist Tiffany Jaeon Shin. She's a Korean-American artist who's been living in Brooklyn, and she did this artist residency at Recess, which is this really fantastic, largely Black artist-run center in Brooklyn. And what Tiffany was going to do, and what she did end up doing, was creating this greenhouse structure within the gallery space, and using JDAM, or Korean natural farming techniques. She planned to inject lactic acid into the soil. By injecting lactic acid, it would actually make the soil more rich with probiotics. And this came after she had read a scientific article finding that immigrants from Asia specifically, but also immigrants coming from outside of North America to the States, lose, I forget the exact percentage, but a very large percentage of their native gut bacteria within a few months of living in the United States. And so that idea of, crossing of borders, immigration, becomes something that's really directly affecting one's gut. And so she saw this creation of this greenhouse in the gallery space using Korean natural farming techniques as a way of remedying that.
What about fermentation is vitalism? This is our second point.
This was really starting to trend when object-oriented ontology was growing, and speculative realism and philosophy, and really just thinking about the idea that non-sentient objects have some kind of vitality or vitalism, and they can be said to be sentient or have agency in a different way. So I think of Jane Bennett's book Vibrant Matter was really key in thinking about this, where if we throw trash into landfills, it isn't just that it's some kind of static, non-bioactive material, that these are having very much alive in terms of its scientific, biological, chemical effects. Of course, when it comes to fermentation, anything from a ginger bug to a kombucha SCOBY to a sourdough starter, these are all living things. They're constituted by living microbes, even if someone might see it, a SCOBY, as an object of sorts. So I was really interested in this idea of seeing the world around us as vital, and that being grounds for environmental responsibility, and being grounds for us being more aware of how we interact with our food and with the objects in the world around us with more thoughtfulness.
Here we can shift to the third point, which is fermentation as accessibility.
I did a project called Sick Theories, for example, that was very much engaged with a community of critical disability studies scholars and artists, and MAD identified scholars and artists. And that's certainly an interest of mine and a passion of mine, but I don't see myself as an expert in that field. And I think making claims about a space being accessible, for example, I really learned a lot from the Sick Theories conference that I co-organized with a friend of mine, Margot Feldman, because to make a space truly accessible for everyone is, in some ways, feels like a bit of an impossible feat. It's almost like there's this ideal standard that you strive toward. I came to fermentation as accessibility metaphorically from the material reality that fermentation does literally make nutrients, vitamins, the digestive process more accessible to the body through that pre-digestion. And Sandra Katz has talked a lot about this as well, that the whole philosophy of fermentation revivalism that he espouses also emphasizes making fermentation more accessible to more kinds of people as a practice. But I think people, when they see the jars, and I think especially when they see jars, a lot of folks think, okay, I need to like have sterile conditions. This is like canning. This is really overwhelming, which I sort of agree. I think the idea of canning and preserving is a little bit daunting to me. But fermentation, on the other hand, I think people are surprised when they say, okay, actually, you don't need those same kinds of conditions. I mean, yes, you should wash your materials before using them and stuff. But that really, when you have the abounding good bacteria of sauerkraut or kombucha or whatnot in an environment, it tends to make it a hostile environment for the quote unquote bad bacteria. So in that sense, it just feels more accessible in that idea of being more welcoming and not being as daunting, not requiring too skilled of a skill set. And of course, I'm not a doctor, and I'm the claims I'm making are just based on my own experiential evidence and people I've talked to. But I know with sourdough bread, for example, and I'm really big into sourdough bread baking, that there are those who have gluten issues, celiac issues, and they find that they can eat sourdough bread no problem, that they don't necessarily have the stomach pain or the bloating or other effects. And so that would be another example of just that idea of bioavailability and pre-digestion and fermented foods being more accessible to bodies. Of course, there are always exceptions to that rule, but that seems to be a trend that I've been picking up on.
Fermentation is also related to recipes and therefore open sourcing the knowledge how to prepare those particular dishes.
The idea of the recipe as an open source model, though, I really love that. I'm such a fan just of like reading recipe books, and I think you're right that the recipe as a form of knowledge and information that can be widely shared and disseminated, especially in the age of social media. It seems like there's a lot of really interesting possibilities there. There's some great cookbooks that came out, like Brian Ford's New World Sourdough. I believe he's from New Orleans. That's like a really fantastic new book that came out. I've been following Carolyn Schiff, who's a New York City-based pastry chef, but she became really well known for the sourdough pancake during the pandemic, and it really is so simple. If you have excess sourdough starter, you literally just pour it onto the pan with some butter, and I've been shocked at how easy and tasty it is. And it's one of those things that you can do savory or sweet. Throughout the pandemic, I think a lot of us are finding, I know I can speak for myself, like it's really opened my eyes to different possibilities for friendship, intimacy, community, and also, sharing of knowledge. And food and sourdough and fermentation has been a really key example. I've been surprised at Instagram, for example. I mean, on a political level, of course, there's some limitations and issues with supporting Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, but I have been surprised at those folks who are using the platforms to make these ideas and practices more accessible to people. I thought a lot about this idea of self-sufficiency and how, on the one hand, making your own sourdough bread is seen as an act of self-sufficiency because you can literally make your own food, and what is more sustaining than a big loaf of bread. And then you have, okay, so you're able to make your own food. But then as soon as you start thinking about self-sufficiency, issues of collectivity come in almost immediately. So I think about the flour shortage that started to happen, at least over here in Canada, where everyone's going out to, alongside the toilet paper shortage, if everyone's starting to bake their own bread and sourdough, all of a sudden we have a flour shortage, because there are those who are, so individualistic or so focused on their own self-sufficiency that they're overstocking on their own materials. So I do think that sourdough is really wrapped up in those tensions around self-sufficiency, but also the need to still be grounded in community and be connected to a collective.
The next one on the list is fermentation is preservation and transformation.
Yeah, I was really struck by that paradox that fermentation is simultaneously something that preserves and something that transforms. And it was this paradox that really was one of the driving forces behind fermenting feminism initially. It was maybe the first idea that really piqued my philosophical curiosity and had me thinking about the applications of this paradox to feminism itself. So thinking about present day feminisms, especially back in 2016 when this project began, which already feels like a bit of a lifetime ago as far as the political context and the conversations we were having. But in this period, it felt like feminism was still, at least in scenes I was a part of, a little bit of a dirty word, or a word that people distance themselves from. It was seen as not necessarily relevant based on its history and the baggage it had accumulated. And I was really curious about, I do think there's a lot of like subconscious misogyny that runs across different cultures, and that is pretty pernicious, and maybe is part of the reason why it's been hard to reclaim terms like feminism more than other terms. I definitely saw possibilities when it came to thinking about, okay, what if we were to theoretically, metaphorically ferment feminism? That means feminism will go through some process of transformation whereby certain things are preserved from the past, from what we've inherited from feminist ancestors, knowledge we've inherited, changes, progressive changes in the world, books, art, innovations of all kinds, that we can preserve those, honor those, uphold those, keep them alive, but then also transform, and maybe with that transformation, aspects of feminism's past, whether it's, white dominated feminisms that aren't adequately aware of the politics of racialization and racism, whether it's issues of trans inclusion in feminisms, whether it's issues of the politics of land and decolonialization and indigenous feminisms, two-spirit feminisms, etc. So I feel like with that transformation, it's about transforming feminism for the present day world and for new contexts. And so that tension between preserving and transforming instead of either or, that the two actually go hand in hand. I'd never really encountered that as a coexisting metaphor until I came across fermentation.
The fifth point is fermentation is interspecies symbiosis and coevolution.
I think this Fermenting Feminism manifesto is a way of, by emphasizing this idea of interspecies symbiosis, this idea that there are multiple species here at work, both within our bodies, outside of our bodies, and within these starter cultures that we're working with, which really ties back to that idea of fermentation as vitalism as well. But this just sort of shifts the focus, really thinking about that idea of working together, symbiosis. During the pandemic, I was in a different house than I've been living in before, and I just started making bread for the first time here using the salt that the people I live with had on hand. And it looked like it was pink Himalayan salt. Everything looked fine in terms of it wasn't iodized, etc. I was using it, but the sourdough bread kept seeming to become deadened, for lack of a better word, at that point of adding the salt, and I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I tried it a couple times, and the bread still turned out okay, but it definitely wasn't as good or as alive and rising as I was used to. And then finally I looked, and I guess the salt that was in the container was different from what the container, like it was kind of bought in bulk, and it actually had been iodized, and all of a sudden I was aware, okay, I did a bit more research, and I realized iodized salt really can render the microorganisms dead in a certain sense. And then, okay, all of a sudden I was reminded in that moment of, okay, this is like living microbes that quite literally are affected by the constitution of the salt, and it will literally have an effect on what the bread looks like and tastes like and smells like. And that was a good reminder.
How fermentation is related to the sixth point, which is fermentation is survival and futurity.
Food sovereignty, food justice, and the role that fermentation can play in food sovereignty, food justice, and food accessibility across communities is very much tied to the possibility of human survival, but also the possibility of our thriving and flourishing from a health level. It's a generalization I made before, but I think it must be true that every culture in the world has some form of fermentation practice, likely tied to preservation.
You work mostly with topics related to fermentation. How much this angle, this take is personal? Is fermentation also a personal practice for you? Is it somehow related to fermentation as a care of the self and care of others?
My interest in fermentation began from a very personal place, almost, anti-professional, where I was just literally in Vancouver, had finished my master's, was struggling to find work in art or academia, ended up working a job as a frontline social worker in mental health and harm reduction, and really loved that work and would arguably have continued doing it maybe even forever, but I was finding it just on a kind of personal level and mental health level just not sustainable for the way I was doing it anyway. I should note too that I wasn't trained in those modes and kind of fell into a very intense, incredible but intense frontline job doing that work. So during that time, I took my first kombucha workshop with a woman named Andrea Potter, who still does fermentation workshops around Vancouver. And she was really great, gave me my first SCOBY, taught kombucha brewing in a way that felt really accessible and exciting. I started brewing kombucha just in my apartment. And from that, it just felt very simple, certainly very personal. I was just brewing it for myself and would drink it, share with friends who came over. But I felt like it was just a very grounding ritual to have, and something that I hadn't really intellectualized in any way or thought about in a political sense or an intellectual sense or whatnot. It was just something that I did. It wasn't until later that this shift toward bridging it with my interests and work in the arts and publications and academia that it started to come to the fore a bit more. I feel like with the pandemic, I know a lot of people are really reassessing their priorities or reassessing what kind of work they do and what they value. And I think for me, I've really come to terms with this idea that in the past few years, I've been wanting to professionalize and maybe attain some kind of like middle class status. I'm from like a working class background and was the first person in my family to go to university or college and etc. And it's interesting with the pandemic, some of the shifts that I'm picking up around me and in my communities and also just within myself is almost wanting to hunker back down to the more activist modes and advocacy and frontline work, that there's something really valuable about writing and art making and, putting together a scientific paper / manifesto or whatnot. And at the same time, really wanting to challenge myself to always stay grounded in the personal as political and be grounded in the needs of the communities around me. I think what I do always comes from a place of the personal and the gut. That said, to keep it accountable to that, I think we always, in whatever field we're in, need to kind of check in with ourselves and ask, why are we doing what we're doing? And to make sure we're still, doing it from a place that feels affirming for our values.
Since we are shifting here to the topics related to activism, we can also shift to another point, which is fermentation as harm reduction.
In terms of what just feels really resonant in like a practical way with certain political concerns. So the last iteration of Fermenting Feminism that I curated was at Access Gallery in Vancouver, BC, on the West Coast here in Canada. But there was something about this Vancouver exhibition that really felt like it integrated the different parts of my life and interests in a way that I felt really thrilled by. So it was the gallery spaces in the same neighborhood that I worked in when I was doing social work, Vancouver's downtown east side neighborhood, which is, somewhat sensationalized and notorious as really riddled with issues of homelessness and drug use, and was on the media for a couple of years ago for having Canada's first safe injection site for in IV drug users, etc. We were really aware from the first steps that in order to do a project of fermenting feminism in this environment, we have to be very, very aware of what we're doing and why, and that we don't want to be part of art as a gentrifying force, which is always a risk. And I mean, maybe it's impossible to avoid. If I'm being, totally honest, I think art is always going to have a bit of that effect. But I think that we can be aware of, okay, how are we actually engaging with the communities who are living here, and can we be bringing anything to the table for them that they can benefit from? But we started to work with a group They're called the Downtown East Side Drinkers Lounge, and it's primarily Indigenous run co-op, very much on the fringes of mainstream harm reduction, where essentially the group pools their money, part of their money together each month and buys alcohol, which they then share. And these are folks who identify as alcoholics or those who require alcohol, have some sort of chemical dependency. And because a lot of them are street entrenched or underhoused, they need to find ways of sourcing alcohol to consume. And so, of course, alcohol is another substance that's fermented. And I was really thinking about this as, okay, how do we maybe engage that community? I also was brought in Carlington Booch, which is based out of Ottawa in Ontario, but they're actually a kombucha microbrewery run by addicts and alcoholics in recovery. That's how they self-identify. I was really intrigued. I actually just encountered them at a farmer's market in Ottawa. I was kind of gravitated toward their booth and started talking to them. And they were mainly younger men who were recently out of rehab, in recovery, brewing kombucha, and also being part of this small scale enterprise. So it was a way of both literally working, keeping busy, making money, but they were finding that on a substance level, on a chemical level, there was something about kombucha that maybe tapped into what alcohol gave them, but didn't get them drunk, doesn't get them high, also has these health benefits and restorative benefits for the gut. So with all of these observations in mind, I was like, okay, I want to kind of bring all these things together in some way into the Vancouver iteration of that exhibition. So we ended up I did an interview with Carlington Booch, which is part of the Critical Booch publication. My friend Andrea Creamer did an interview with the Downtown East Side Drinkers Lounge, and that also became part of the Critical Booch publication. And I brought some Carlington Booch. We ordered some in for the exhibition. I also ordered some in for the project that Tiffany J. Onshin did in Brooklyn back in February, and they were really excited. They were like, this is the first time we've gone international. But so we had like their kombucha there, and I was talking a lot about kombucha as harm reduction when I was over in New York City as well. So, and a kind of funny surprise that I didn't expect. I really do believe in the power of art and the value of exhibitions as a form of knowledge and sharing. I'm also not naive in saying that it's for everyone necessarily, and I understand that there are those who don't necessarily feel like there's much that they can really take from a contemporary art exhibition. But that said, I did my curatorial talk, and Andrea brought two of the folks from the Downtown East Side Drinkers Lounge to it. They hung out in the space. The four of us talked after. They didn't know about kombucha before, and all of a sudden they were like, kombucha could actually be a really useful way for us to include those who are sober in our Downtown East Side Drinkers Lounge, because there are those who were a part of the lounge who that was their primary form of community, but for whatever reason, maybe they, like doctor's orders, they really could no longer be a functioning alcoholic. They had to get sober, they had to dry out, and so kombucha could be a way for them still being a part of it and being able to hang out in the space, and they would also have something to be doing and something to be consuming. And so that was an example where it felt like kombucha was literally serving as a form of harm reduction in an environment without pushing a certain meta narrative. It isn't saying, people have to be sober and drink kombucha and get really quote unquote healthy. Like, that's not what we're saying, but it is about saying, okay, here's another option alongside.
Point number 9 is fermentation is queer time.
As far as my choice of queer time here, I am indebted to queer theorists like Jack Halberstam, who in their book In a Queer Time and Place talks about this idea of normative time versus queer time. That normative time would be both on a kind of day-to-day level of, you wake up at wake up at 7 a.m., go to work from 9 to 5, have dinner and go to bed, or the kind of normative time in a life cycle sense, where by a certain age you have children, by a certain age you get married, that there's a certain way that you structure your life according to that kind of heteronormativity, capitalistic understandings of a life and a lifestyle and time. And so for Jack Halberstam, as a queer theorist, they were really thinking about, okay, what does it mean to actually queer those normative notions of time, have alternative ways of living, whether it's from, a whole life cycle sense or whether it's from a time sense. So that's really the thinking there. But I also think that just this idea of queering time in a general sense, that it's no longer the dominant forms of temporality that we're used to in an advanced late capitalist, uh, for me, North American context, where everything's about convenience, maybe. And I do mention that example in the article where when I was at a kombucha making workshop in Toronto, and there were a couple women who said, like, wait, I have to wait 7 days for this to ferment. Like, they seemed very surprised that it wasn't some kind of instantaneous process. And it was a really interesting moment for me and a good reminder for me that maybe, well, that comes down to education and people getting becoming educated in the timelines of fermentation and how it works and what is actually happening with it as a cycle that literally requires time, but also this idea that when it is queering that dominant understanding of instantaneity and like being able to have something ready, maybe within a couple hours at most, and thinking about something as requiring a week, for example, is somewhat out of the purview of how we view food production, in a mainstream way.
Yeah, the fact is that the same bacterial starter might take very different time to ferment depending on the temperature and other conditions in where we actually ferment this batch.
Definitely. I know I made my first ginger bug this summer, and what I was reading online for about how long it should take, mine was taking quite a lot longer than that. And I started to worry, okay, am I doing something wrong? Is there, the environment's not right? But then it just took like a couple extra days, and all of a sudden it was really bubbly and happy. And it was a really good lesson for me. I know people have I think whenever you're starting your own starter, that variance in time that you mentioned is really striking, especially with sourdough starters as well. Someone might be told it can take 7 days or 10 days, but it can really vary based on like temperature, environment, etc.
The 10th point of your article, which is also a conclusion, is fermentation is collaboration. And here also I would like to ask you about the future. Maybe there is some collaborations waiting for you.
I have a few ideas in mind. I feel like we're in this strange time right now from an art world perspective where it's hard to plan exhibitions. And I think even our conception of what constitutes an exhibition or what an exhibition should look like is really changing. I'm part of a project at the Durham Art Gallery, which is in Durham, Ontario, a smaller town north of Toronto. And their gallery director, Jacqueline Charisma, she put together this really exciting project that's actually inspired by Octavia E. Butler's Parable series. And so Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And for those of you who don't know, Octavia E. Butler's very much like ahead of her time, African-American sci-fi, speculative fiction, feminist writer, and who didn't actually live long enough to finish the Parable series that she was working on. And so somewhat tragically leaves things open-ended. But what Jacqueline was really interested in was she invited 4 curators, I'm one of them, to each lead one of 4 different exhibition series. So they're called Teacher, Trickster, Chaos, and Clay. And I'm doing Clay, which will be next fall. And I've just started to think about doing something around sourdough specifically. There's this idea of acorn bread and self-sufficiency and growing your own food. That's part of the Parable series because it's in this apocalyptic environment. And people are starting to think about food and sustainability in different ways. I just finished a text about sourdough for this publication, Peripheral Review, that should be out soon. But I would love to do something in my homelands here of the prairies. I'm really fascinated by the history of wheat and agriculture, especially tied to colonialism, and thinking about the fermenting traditions that are here. We are finally, after a long delay, going to be launching the Fermenting Feminism Copenhagen publication. I believe within the coming month. So we're just working on the last steps of producing that. And so that's really just documentation of the gathering in Copenhagen last fall, which was, I guess, technically pretty much exactly 2 years ago. And it will show some of the conference proceedings and documentation from that, as well as text that some of the contributors to that iteration of the project wrote after the fact of the gathering. So we'll be sharing that online.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it very much. It seems that that's it. We went through all the points building the framework of your article titled Fermenting Feminism as Methodology and Metaphor. I will put the link to this article in the description of this episode so our listeners can refer to it.
Sure, yeah. The great thing about environmental humanities is it's open access, and so it's free regardless of institutional affiliation.
Thank you so much for today. It was such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Agnieszka. Really, really great to chat with you. And if anyone wants to reach out to me too, I guess I can give my contact info. I can be reached at lgfournier@gmail.com. My website's laurenfournier.net. Always am super keen to meet people who are interested in fermentation, and always happy to chat.
That was Lauren Fournier. You can follow her Instagram account at lgfournier. This episode starts a new series on Ferment Radio that focuses entirely on feminist issues. It is our sisterhood act of solidarity with the ongoing protests in Poland against a law that prohibits abortion. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Culture of Cultures and is produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.